Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor. I'm a Sony Imaging Ambassador, and I'd like to run you through my recommended settings for capturing fast action. These are the appropriate settings for also capturing birds in flight. Of course, in getting the right settings is going to make it a lot easier, so we're going to have lots less rejects when we're looking through our sequences of images. Now, of course, when we're looking at action, I'm looking at freezing fast action primarily to track rapid movement and also to shoot in bursts or sequences of images. Now, typically I'll start with a shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second to freeze the fast action. And of course, this is most appropriate when shooting birds in flight. I may occasionally push that shutter speed even higher. Of course, there are alternatives when shooting action motorsports. For instance, it's common to lower the shutter speed and then pan the camera accurately to follow our rapidly moving subject. And we can be using shutter speeds of 1/250th of a second or even slower. And this gives you the movement blur behind the subject that is moving rapidly. But I will focus first with the freezing of the fast action. Now, there are lots of settings to consider. Here I've just listed 10 of the important settings, and of course that is a lot to remember. So what I'm going to recommend, and I'll be going through these individually in just a short while, is that you try and capture these in or register them in one of the memory settings so that we can recall most of these settings just by moving the shoot mode dial. Now, I typically have 3 memories assigned to that shoot mode dial. I call it my PAL workflow: portrait, action, landscape. And so I just move the shoot mode dial to number 2 when I want to record fast moving action, and that includes birds in flight. Now, there is another series of memories that are very useful with the Alpha-1, and these are the registered custom shoot settings. These are up to 11 settings that can be recalled by holding down a custom key. So we don't need to turn the shoot mode dial to 1, 2 or 3. We just need to hold down a custom key that we've assigned to recall these 11 settings. And these 11 settings can also override the focus mode and drive mode that is on the physical hard dials on the top left of the camera. So these are especially useful for Alpha 9 and Alpha 1 photographers. Now, before I get into the camera settings, I should point out that it's not just the camera settings, it is also your choice of lens. Now, you are going to increase your hit rate by using a native E-mount lens. That's not necessarily a Sony lens, it's just a E-mount lens, whether it's designed by Sigma or Tamron, etc. It's also important to look at the specs of that lens. You want to be looking for the linear focus motors, and it's not just the long telephoto lenses where we can record fast action and sports. We can also use prime lenses. Most of Sony's recent primes have these linear focus motors. For instance, the 50mm f1.2 has 4 of these linear focus motors to move the heavier lens elements really rapidly. And it's not just about getting one pin sharp image, it's about getting sequences of images where the lens can actually track rapidly with the subject even as it's getting closer to the camera lens. Now, if that GM lens is out of your price bracket, there are other cheaper prime lenses to consider. Perhaps one of the best and cheapest prime lenses is the FE85 1.8. It's not a G, it's not a GM or a Zeiss design lens, but it does have that linear focus motor and it can keep up with the fast action. All you need to be sure of is getting closer to your subject matter. Of course, one of my favorite fast primes is the 135mm G Master. This is exceptionally sharp. It does have the advantage of having that very wide aperture, so we can typically drop the background into a smooth bokeh when we're recording our fast action. As you can see from this wedge-tailed eagle about to catch some prey mid-air, it is absolutely can keep up with the Alpha 1 camera. And it's not just the Sony lenses, of course, that have these linear focus motors. If we take a look at the 135 2.8 Zeiss Batis lens, this is also a fast focusing lens. It's a little bit smaller and lighter, perhaps no cheaper than that G Master, but it is a little bit lighter and can keep up with the Alpha 1 camera. Of course, one of my favorite lenses to use with the Alpha 1 is the lens that was launched on the same day as the original Alpha 9. It was launched with the Alpha 9 to basically make the A9 have a point. Basically, it has a lens that it can use to shoot at that 20 frames per second. Now we're up to 30 frames per second. So the 100-400 lens is certainly a good choice for shooting fast action and birds in flight. If you're needing a little bit more reach because you can't quite get close enough to your birds in flight, then of course there is the 200-600G lens, and this also is a very fast focusing lens and can keep up with the Alpha 1 and birds in flight, as you can see from this snowy owl coming directly towards the lens. Now, if you're not constrained by the budget, some of the favorite lenses used by bird photographers and sports photographers as well is the 400 and 600 millimeter prime lenses. They have the advantage of having those wider apertures and very fast focus motors, and of course, being G Master prime lenses, they're incredibly sharp. So long as your panning skills are up to it, then you can capture images that are absolutely breathtaking in their sharpness when matched with a high resolution camera such as the Alpha 1. Now, I do occasionally get to borrow the 600mm G Master, and it's certainly a joy to use with that very shallow depth of field and fast focusing. So I'm not in the water here, but I'm shooting across the water to this dog just about to collect its frisbee, and as you can see, it gives you razor sharp detail from this G Master Prime. Now, on the issue of teleconverters to get closer, just remember we do have 50 megapixels on the Alpha 1, so we can crop really aggressively. It's a term that I call croppability. Don't underestimate how much you can crop in without having to use those teleconverters. The teleconverters will lose a little bit of the sharpness, especially with the 2x teleconverter, and we also lose a little bit of AF performance. So if you can avoid using a teleconverter and you can just crop aggressively instead, that would be my first recommendation. You can see from this greyhound shot here, I've cropped really aggressively, but I've still got more than 2160 pixels high, which is the height of a 4K display, no matter what the size of that display. So we're not going to sacrifice any quality by cropping this aggressively, so long as we're using good glass. And of course the Sony telephoto lenses are pin sharp wide open, so there isn't really a need to stop down, thereby raising our ISO. We can confidently shoot wide open. So yes, buy the teleconverters if you still can't get close enough, but by all means just shoot and then crop in post. Now, as you can see from these three aggressively cropped images, you're looking at the detail. Hopefully you're watching this movie in 4K, and you can see that we've not lost any detail from these rapidly moving greyhounds, and these greyhounds are really moving very quickly. Now, of course, because of the pixel-rich sensor on the Alpha 1, we can also shoot in APS-C mode. There's no advantages to shooting in APS-C mode other than we increase the size of the buffer, and of course the subject appears larger in the viewfinder, but it does save cropping in post. But one of the options for people who are prepared to shoot in APS-C mode at 21 megapixels is that you could, for instance, use an APS-C zoom lens. Now, there is one very fast Sony zoom lens that is APS-C. It's the 70-350mm G lens. It's sharp, it is fast focusing courtesy of those linear focus motors, and it is very light and portable. You compare this with the 200-600 and you realize why this lens might be attractive to some Alpha 1 users who sometimes want to travel much lighter than carrying that 200-600. Now, I have lots of lens reviews on the Alpha Creative Skills YouTube channel, and I have focused on a lot of the later lenses that do have these fast linear focus motors. So if you're looking at trying to make a decision, say between the 400GM and the 200-600G, my lens review of the 200-600 basically compares those two choices, because I don't really expect photographers to buy both of those lenses. Okay, so here are my action settings. You may want to pause the video and just take a longer look. Now, a couple of these sections in the table are colored red-orange instead of blue. These are settings that are not held by the memory that we might register. So they're the drive mode and focus mode on the top left of the dial. If we're setting up that memory, of course, we have to turn to our preferred shoot mode. Now, I tend to shoot action and birds in flight in aperture priority with ISO auto minimum shutter speed, so I can control that minimum shutter speed that the camera is using. Some people will prefer to shoot in shutter priority. Some photographers will prefer to shoot in manual exposure with ISO auto, which is still an auto exposure mode. Now, one of the settings that isn't currently registered by that memory, I don't know whether it's an oversight, is the finder frame rate. We have a very high resolution electronic viewfinder on the Alpha 1. It's at its highest resolution when the finder frame rate is set to standard. That resolution will drop if we need a faster refresh rate. And typically we want that faster refresh rate if we're panning the camera really quickly. So we do want to move that to high or higher, and that is not registered by the memory. So let's move forward here. So if I've set up all of the memories, simply what I would do is turn that shoot mode dial to number 2. Just look on the top left to make sure that I've got my focus mode, continuous autofocus set, AFC, and also my preferred drive mode, my preferred frames per second, whether it be low, medium, high, or high plus. Okay, so I would then register that on page 4 of the shooting menu to my preferred 1, 2, or 3 on that shoot mode dial. Now, just remember there I put that little yellow arrow to say those the shoot mode and focus mode is not held by that memory. So you do just need to glance on the top left-hand side after you've recalled your memory setting there. Okay, so because of that finder frame rate is not held by the memory, I would strongly recommend that you assign that to your function menu for stills photography. So you can quickly change from standard when you're shooting portraits or landscapes to choosing that high or high plus. To be honest, you'd have to be moving the camera really rapidly to want to use that high plus. The high setting is still quite a fast refresh rate. That, of course, is personal preference. Okay, so here I'm looking at those 3 shoot modes. Shutter priority, which is typically often considered the standard for shooting sports because shutter speed is your priority. But I've typically always favored the aperture priority with ISO auto minimum shutter speed. So there are slight differences here. The aperture priority with ISO auto minimum shutter speed does protect exposure. If it can't quite hit that shutter speed because the ISO is already maxed out, then it will start to slow the shutter speed down so we get an appropriate exposure. There is a risk of underexposing when using shutter priority in those instances. Same with manual exposure. It is a good setting if you want to both choose your aperture and your shutter speed, but once that ISO is maxed out, then there is a risk again of underexposing, and that isn't the case with aperture priority with ISO auto minimum shutter speed. Okay, so on the subject of ISO, we can access that from the control wheel by pressing the right button on that control wheel. And some people might be keen to lower that amount from the maximum 102,400 because they don't want to shoot at ISO values that high. But of course, you have to think this through carefully. If you can't have that extra ISO value, you are at risk of blurring the subject through movement blur. So you have to ask yourself, do I want a noisier image or do I want a subject that's not sharp? So I don't see much point in lowering that maximum ISO when using ISO Auto myself. Now, if you are choosing that aperture priority with ISO Auto minimum shutter speed, of course you'll have to go into the menu's exposure color menu, page 1, and then you can get to that ISO Auto minimum shutter speed. I don't really expect you to go into that menu each time you want to change your mind on that minimum shutter speed. So what I would recommend is either you put it in the function menu, so for quicker access, or like me, because it is one of my frequently changed settings, is I've reassigned the custom key 1 to ISO Auto minimum shutter speed. Now I do stress that I don't have to lower the camera to change my mind about the minimum shutter speed. I can do this with the viewfinder at my eye. I just need to press C1 and then use the front dial to roll to a faster shutter speed or a slower shutter speed. So if I notice I'm shooting birds in flight at 1/2000th of a second and the ISO value is only say 160, then of course I will favor using a faster shutter speed and comfortably shoot at ISO 320 instead. So and of course if I don't need those faster shutter speeds, then I can of course always slow it down. Now, if you're choosing any of those 3 auto exposure modes, you will need to use exposure compensation quite a lot. So if your background behind your subject is much lighter than average, for instance a sky, you're going to be using a positive exposure compensation, typically +1 or more, so that the bird isn't underexposed against that bright sky. Now you can look at the histogram for guidance here when choosing that appropriate exposure compensation. Likewise, if your bird in flight is flying against a dark tree-lined background, you're going to overexpose, and this is much more serious really, because if your bird has light plumage, then there is a risk of overexposing the feathers of your bird, because the camera wants to make that background average lighter and keep increasing the exposure. So you will need to use a negative exposure compensation in those instances to lower the exposure to protect the brighter highlights of your subject. And so that is really, really important when doing that. Of course, if the background behind your bird in flight is changing really rapidly from bright sky to dark trees, then of course it does make sense to leave the auto exposure modes behind and choose manual exposure with a manually selected ISO value. Basically what you're doing is you're setting the exposure for the ambient light, so the exposure doesn't change if the background behind your flying bird changes. So long as the bird doesn't fly from the sun to the shade, then you will have a good sequence of exposures as the bird is flying. So typically what I would do is I'd start at f6.3, 1/2000th of a second, ISO 320 in sunlit conditions. And if it's not sunlit, I will just simply raise the ISO. If there's light cloud cover, I might go to 640, and if there's darker cloud cover, I might go up to ISO 1600, etc. So I can be guided about choosing that appropriate exposure by using zebras. Zebras for raw shooters should be set to 109 plus for a lower limit to give you guidance. So then when you see your zebras over maybe white clouds in the sky or over the white plumage of a white bird, if you see those zebras, you need to lower the ISO. Sorry, you need to lower the ISO to decrease the exposure so the zebras disappear from view. So this is a good benchmark for setting the appropriate exposure for the ambient light conditions when using fully manual exposure. Now, if you want to check out a video tutorial on my Alpha Creative Skills YouTube channel, just go to that Zebra 109 Plus for raw shooters, and this outlines the value of this exposure assist part of that workflow. Okay, faster and fastest. This is really where we get to grips with making sure that all of the images in our sequences are pin sharp. So the first thing, of course, to do is we can pretty much on the Alpha 1, if our subject is moving slowly or quickly or even really rapidly, we need to be in that AFC. We can pretty much leave it there most of the time, to be honest, unless we're shooting static landscapes, and then we can move it to AFS. The drive mode, of course, is where we choose the number of frames per second. Now, just because the camera is capable of shooting 30 frames per second, we don't have to be shooting 30 frames all of the time if the subject or the action is unfolding a little bit more slowly. So you will want to modify that. And we can actually fine-tune the number of frames per second for the low, medium and high. So you could set it for 5, 10 and 15, or make some modifications to those values if you like. So the high plus, of course, is where we're really needing to be shooting at the maximum frames per second. So all of these are basically being captured on the electronic shutter. The Alpha 1 does have a mechanical shutter, but as soon as we go to AFC and continuous mode, the camera will auto select the electronic shutter in these instances. Okay, so you won't really have to worry about switching between mechanical and electronic in these instances. So there you see it is set to auto. If you want to force it to electronic or force it to mechanical, you can. If you force it to mechanical, however, you will slow the frames per second down really significantly. You'll be hitting perhaps 10 frames per second instead of 30. Now let's just go back to that slide. There is, of course, if you are shooting in shutter priority mode, there is an option to select variable shutter. We can select very small increments of shutter speed. This is very valuable when when sports photographers are capturing events under artificial LED lighting, and you can find the precise shutter speed that removes flicker from those LED lights. So if you are having a problem with flickering light sources, then move out of aperture priority or manual exposure, go into shutter priority, activate the anti-flicker shoot to on, and choose the variable shutter as well. And then simply you just look as you modify your shutter speed setting until the flickering in the viewfinder or on the monitor disappears, and then you're good to go. So those photographers who have typically grown up with using back button AF, then you will want to uncouple the autofocus mechanism from the shutter release. So you will go into that AF/MF menu, page 1, and switch the AF with shutter to off. Now, if you've not been a back button autofocus user, there isn't any really advantage to doing this. This sort of workflow goes back to periods where the focus mechanisms were a little bit cruder on our cameras, and back button autofocus did offer certain advantages. Of course, I don't want to change the workflow of people who have been using it for years, so those people will continue using back button autofocus, but there is no performance advantages to using that workflow any longer. So let's take a look at the 30 frames per second. Some of the reviewers, when the Alpha 1 was released, had trouble getting the 30 frames per second because we can only get that 30 frames per second if we're using a fast focusing lens with those linear focus motors, and just dotting our I's and crossing our T's and make sure that we have all of the appropriate settings to allow the camera to hit that maximum frames per second. A couple of those settings is we need to set one of the settings to the release, and that is not the default. So you're not going to hit your 30 frames per second until we change some of those settings. So what we're looking at is we're looking at using one of the non-tracking AF areas. So tracking can track a subject so that when it disappears behind a foreground obstacle, the camera carries on tracking that subject matter. But of course, in most instances, our subjects are not going behind foreground obstacles, and so we don't need to track. So when I'm recording this dog catching a frisbee, we're not having to track. We can just let the camera focus in the focus area. We also set the priority setting in AFC, which is the AF/MF menu, page 1, from balanced emphasis, and we set it to release. Once we've done that and we're using a fast focusing lens, we will hit the 30 frames per second. And typically what I use this for is just short bursts, maybe 1 or 2 second bursts of images where it's very difficult to predict the decisive moment. Such as if you were recording, capturing a baseball match, to get the ball very close to the bat would be incredibly difficult to time. So if we just do a burst of maybe 30 images, we're much more likely to get the ball exactly where we want it, i.e. very close to the bat. So there is the priority set in AFC located in the menus for you. Now remember, we are recording all of these to a memory, or I'm encouraging you to record to the memory. So you really only have to set this up once to record all of these memory settings, and then the memory will do all of the work for you. Now, if you're a sort of photographer working at a sports event where the camera has to be really silent, such as right next to a professional golf player who's swinging, the camera can't afford to make any noise. Now, you can switch off the artificial sound linked to the electronic shutter, but of course the camera isn't completely silent when we've done that. It can still make a noise. For instance, when you switch the camera off, occasionally the camera will take a shot with its mechanical shutter to do some routine maintenance, which is pixel mapping. We can basically go into silent mode settings and basically defer that pixel mapping to a time when we want it to do that function, so that we're not at danger of making any sound when we're right next to a pro golfer at a tournament. So of course, the camera can shoot in silent when using that electronic shutter, but to ensure that the camera makes absolutely no noises, we need to go into those silent mode settings. If we are shooting with the camera completely silently, it's very difficult to know that the camera is actually taking any photographs without some sort of visual identifier to say, I am now taking pictures. So this is where you go into shoot timing and remain shoot options, and that's the setup menu, page 7. So typically my favorite visual display is type 2. We get this aqua flashing box around the size of the frame area. So if you've gone down from wide to zone, it'll start flickering around your zone area to say, well, I'm taking pictures now. So there's a clear idea that the camera is working. And of course, we want to really know when we're running out of buffer. Especially important that if we need to reserve some shots for the next piece of action that might happen very quickly after the action that we're currently capturing. So we have that vertical white bar, and that white bar will get shorter and shorter as the buffer starts declining. That is the number of the frames that the camera can hold in its memory before writing them to the memory card. Now, of course, that buffer will clear a lot more rapidly if we're using at least one CF Express Type A card, because we can write those files to that card pretty much nearly 3 times faster than we can using the fastest SD cards. And so if you are shooting maybe sequences of 200 or 250 shots, you will want the buffer to clear really rapidly so that we have the buffer cleared for the next piece of action. So certainly having that CF Express Type A is going to be very valuable to you. Now, of course, we need to set up the 2 card slots for our workflow that we prefer. There are 3 options for this. Okay, so we can just choose to record maybe RAW to slot 1. When the card in slot 1 is full, we have auto switch media switched on, so it just starts recording on slot 2 as soon as slot 1 is full. Now, when I'm shooting action, I typically shoot in compressed RAW. That means that we get the maximum number of frames in the buffer. We are going to increase the size of the buffer by shooting compressed because they're the smaller RAW files. Now, you might get raw compression artifacts when we're really aggressively editing a file, maybe on sort of landscape photography where we've been shooting into the light and we're lightening the shadows by 3-4 stops. That typically aggressive post-production editing doesn't happen to sports action images, and so you're going to be very unlikely to see any drop in quality because you've been shooting in raw compressed. If that is an issue for you, then you can switch to lossless compression. They're slightly smaller than the uncompressed, and you're going to get more files in your buffer. Okay, the other option is, of course, to shoot RAW to one card and JPEG to another. This would be advantageous for maybe a sports photographer who needs to move JPEG images over to their picture editor much more rapidly than maybe uploading RAW files back to their picture editor. So, of course, you would just go into slot 2 looking for your images that you can then transfer, but you do have that RAW file master when you're creating your hero folio image later. The third option, of course, is to record the same file to both slots. This would be favored maybe by a wedding photographer who needs to record exactly the same files to the second card, almost as like an insurance policy should that first card get corrupted. And of course, because you can't repeat a wedding, then of course they would just take the files from that second card. If you are shooting in the raw file format, you can shoot different uncompressed and compressed to different slots, so that is an option. So you've got 3 basic workflows. Just remember, when you go into those record media settings, you can go down to image quality to decide what file you want going to what card. So this is a really important one, subject, and a lot of people ask me, Mark, what is the best focus area when shooting birds? And of course, that's like saying, what is the best gear to drive around in my car? Third might get you off from the traffic lights, and you could get up a reasonable pace on the freeway. But of course, there are other gears, because the other gears are helpful in certain situations. So the focus area is going to change depending on what you're shooting, and so I'll just go into that in a little bit of detail. Now, by default, Sony program the C2 key to changing the focus area. This means that without lowering the camera from my eye, I can press the C2 key, I can move the rear or front dial and modify that focus area in just a second or two. So it doesn't take much time to change the focus area, just as it doesn't take much time to change gear in a manual shift car. Now, a word about the wide focus area. Now, a lot of people coming over from DSLRs are loath to use that wide focus area because they're typically not used on DSLR cameras. And one of the reasons that they're not is because wide on a DSLR is not very wide, and you can still completely miss your subject when shooting with all of the focus areas activated. So it's no guarantee of picking up your subject. But of course, with the Sony, the focus areas, the focus sensors cover pretty much the entire sensor. So we're almost certainly going to pick up the bird in flight using that wide focus area. And there's no point in using a single focus area or a small spot and trying to put that onto the bird using the multi-selector or joystick if the wide would just do that instantly for us 99% of the time. So for instance, with this vulture here, wide is going to get this every day of the week. It's not going to be indecisive about what subject you're photographing. Front and center is the algorithm that wide uses, and if your subject is close to the camera, closer than the background, i.e., and is reasonably close, it doesn't even have to be in the center, but just off to one side, the camera will still focus on that bird in flight. And so typically, if I'm working with a single subject that I can get anywhere near to the center of the frame, wide is just an easy focus area to use. So I always start with wide and then drop down to smaller focus areas if and when needed. Now just remember, press that C2 key, roll that front dial, and I can drop from wide to zone to center to spot as I need to. Now here I'm shooting in a sporting event where there's other people in front of my primary target, and so to make sure the camera doesn't pick up a subject that's closer to the camera and pull focus on that, I just move down from wide to zone, and then that it uses the same algorithm, what is front and center inside of that zone. And again, 99 times out of 100 I don't need to put a spot on that person. Of course, in this instance, when I'm shooting through branches in the tree, and there are some branches that are very close to the camera, of course I need to basically thread a needle through those branches and put a spot on the bird. My preferred spot focus is the expand spot, and I will then put that on the bird. The expand spot is useful because it's basically a small spot, but if it can't find an edge of sufficient contrast running through the small spot, it automatically expands out looking for an edge it can find focus on. If you were to put a small spot just on the white feathers on the bird's chest, you might get into a position where the focus starts hunting backwards and forwards because it can't find an edge to focus on. So again, in this instance, using a small spot ignores the tree that is in front of the bird. So in these instances, yes, put a spot, especially if the bird is static. It's easier just to put the spot on the bird. And in this instance, where I have a bower bird building its bower for its courting routine, is I don't want to hit the bower in front or around the bird, so I just put the spot onto the bird's eye, and then it will track that if I've got one of the tracking. So tracking is very useful if you know that a bird is going to take to the wing, and the big raptors typically fly off into the wind to get more lift. Then I will put the expand spot with a tracking option onto one side of the frame, because I'm always going to be a little bit behind when the bird actually takes off. So the camera will have already started tracking that bird over to the center of the frame before I actually start panning to follow that bird. So this is the great thing about having those focus areas covering almost the entire area, is I can move that spot almost over to the extreme edge of the frame and then have the tracking take over when I'm least prepared and the bird does actually take flight. Okay, the tracking of the Alpha 1 is state-of-the-art. It is absolutely fabulous, like it was on the Alpha 9 cameras. And so I need to talk about some of the settings with the tracking. Now here I'm showing that this was the hero moment where I've got my kiteboarding guy aloft and with the decisive moment, but obviously there's a sequence of frames leading up to as he takes to the air. And just before he takes to the air, somebody walks in front of the camera. Now, if you look at that center frame on the left side there, you'll see that the guy is pretty much completely obscured by the person walking in front of the camera. We can just about make out one of the wires going off to the guy's kite. And so the tracking is actually holding on to the distance of where that subject was, and will basically regain it as soon as that subject emerges from behind the obstacle. Now, the way to hold on to your obstacle for the longest amount of time, i.e. the stickiest setting, is to go into AF tracking sensitivity. That's the AF/MF menu, page 1. And instead of using the standard setting, number 3, lower it to number 1, which is locked on. I find a lot of people are raising it to responsive, because responsive sounds a good word, but responsive, it's going to give up on your original subject much more quickly than had you used locked on. So locked on, you can lose your subject for a number of frames and then it will reacquire it. It basically hangs on to the distance of where your subject was, looking for that subject to re-emerge. Now, if you do need maybe to move between 1 and 5 because you do want your camera to jump to another subject, maybe you're tracking a herd of zebras and one zebra is not that important, you just want to jump to the one that's in front of your original object, so you might want it to be responsive, number 5, is to put AF tracking sensitivity somewhere where you can get to it very quickly. Again, the FN menu is the ideal place. Now you don't have to lower the camera to use that FN menu. You can just press the FN button, navigate using the multi-selector or joystick to your option, and then use the front and rear dial to change your options there. Here is a sequence of images that I captured just recently showing how sticky the locked on setting is. So I'm tracking a bird. That bird goes behind a very large foreground obstacle, and in the center there's just the tip of the trailing wing, or maybe its tail there, and then I've got 2 frames where there is no bird at all in the frame. And then of course, as that bird emerges from behind that obstacle, I'm tracking it straight away. So I'm much more likely to get my bird in flight as it ignores trees and branches that the bird flies behind. Now, of course, if you're changing your focus setting periodically, there are a lot of focus areas to choose from, and you might never choose some of them, like small spot or medium or large spot. You might just decide, well, I use maybe the small spot occasionally, and then I just go to the expand spot. I don't need the medium and large, so you can deselect them so you don't have to move through them as you're dialing through and changing your focus areas. So just go into AFMF menu, page 2, focus area limit, and just take out the focus areas that you find yourself never using. We're now going to look at a touch operation. If you are a back button autofocus user, obviously if you've got your thumb held down on your AF on button on the back of the camera, you're not going to then be able to touch and track anything. So this is sort of preserved for people who have still got their thumb free, really. Let's go into this. Of course, if you've switched touch operation on and you're using the monitor, you basically can cycle through 3 options. Touch focus, that pulls focus onto a precise distance and stays there. There is the much more useful touch tracking if your subject is moving, and then touch again, and we go into cancel touch focus and touch tracking. So there are 3 choices there that if we can see the bird on the monitor, we can just touch it with our finger and have the camera take over the tracking from there. Of course, we do need to switch the touch operation on. That setup menu, page 5, and you may have a custom key assigned to that as well. There are in the menu again is the option for touch function in shooting. This allows you to cycle between touch focus and touch tracking. Obviously important if we're not using the monitor, but we're using the electronic viewfinder. And of course, this is one of the great features of the Alpha 1 is we can use the monitor not for looking at our subject, but as a touch pad. This is where we can just with the camera at our eye put the thumb on the monitor and then target the subject that we want. So again, with the camera at my eye, if I'm looking at the more distant subject, I just need to move my thumb to that subject, lift my thumb from the monitor, and then the camera will track that subject instead of the near subject. So it can be a little bit of it might take a while to get used to using this feature, but it is something that is a great feature if you need to move maybe quickly from a wide focus area to specifically target something moving in the frame that is not in the center. This can be a great feature. So here I am moving from the foreground motorcycle to the previous world champion, Marc Marquez, who's chasing the leading motorcycle down, maybe about to do an overtaking maneuver. So I quickly just move my thumb to the left of the frame, lift my thumb, and then we're now tracking the trailing motorcycle. And of course, by pressing the center button on that control wheel, I cancel that tracking operation. One of the things that overrides any focus area is the priority settings. Face eye priority will override your focus area if it finds that priority it's looking for. And of course, we're talking about eye and face priority. So for instance, this martial arts expert is throwing a punch towards the camera. The camera does like front and center, which would be the fist coming towards the camera. But of course the eye will engage, the IAF will engage and completely ignore front and center algorithm and move back to the eye. So this is an incredibly useful feature. We don't need to put a tracking spot on the eye. The eye priority will just override my zone or wide focus area. One of the things that we will often want to do as wildlife photographers is basically change from human IAF to animal IAF and from animal IAF to bird IAF. And so putting subject detection in the FN menu is incredibly valuable. So what we can do then is, again, without lowering the camera from our eye, we just press the function button. That's step one. Step two is to move the selection using the multi-selector to our subject detection menu, and then move the front dial 1 or 2 clicks to change our subject detection. And again, this just takes a second or two to switch from human to animal, from animal to bird. And then of course, when we've got IAF for animals detected, we're going to push back beyond the nose, which is front and center, and go back and focus on those eyes. And this is incredibly useful if we're working with very shallow depth of field, as I am here with the 600 G Master Prime. So the focus is going beyond the eye, beyond the droplets of water, ignoring all of that, and then pushing back to the gaze of this dog who's running down his ball floating in the water. Bird IF is of course a great new feature for the Alpha 1. It's one of the huge attractions of the Alpha 1 to bird photographers. Now this does work incredibly well if the bird has a well pronounced eye, as you can see in this gull here. It's very easy for the bird IF to find the eye on the bird. It sort of knows that there's a beak and then there's a head, and then goes straight to the eye and can track that as the bird is in flight. Now this isn't always the case. It's not always as easy for the camera to detect or find the eye. One of the important things about IAF, however, is it will look outside of the focus area. So if we had been using zone and the eye is outside of that zone, it will ignore that focus area and move outside of that focus area to pick up the eye. And again, because this bird has quite a distinctive eye that's catching the light, it's no problem for the camera to find that eye. There are instances, however, where maybe the bird has a dark eye surrounded by dark feathers and it's in the shade, and then the bird IF can really struggle. Now, in some instances, it might even be easier if you switch off face eye priority if you're encountering a situation such as this, because what I have picked up occasionally is the bird IAF perhaps recognizes that it is a bird, but then starts moving around the subject looking for the eye. So instead of being able to lock on a spot on the head, you can find your focus area sort of wandering around, and it might even move over to the tail looking to see if there's an eye on the tail of the bird. So I dare say the algorithms will get better over time, but in some instances where bird IF is struggling, you might just want to switch off face eye priority and maybe put a spot on a colorful piece of the bird plumage, and then have the tracking track that color instead of the eye. Let's go back to the subject of those register custom shoot settings, often referred to as recall custom hold. This is where we assign it to a custom button. We have to hold that custom button down to initiate up to 11 settings. You don't have to use all 11. I typically only use 3 or 4, and I find this incredibly useful for the Alpha 1 because it can override the focus mode and drive mode on the top left of the camera, which the shoot modes on the shoot mode dial 1, 2 and 3 cannot do. So for instance, I find number 1 really useful if I program that to the focus hold button on the lens when I want to move from freezing fast action to a slow shutter speed pan. Typically I'll shoot motorcycles that are racing at over 200 kilometers an hour to 1/320th of a second to get some movement drag. The custom hold 2 I will typically use if I don't want to shoot something that has now become static at 20 or 30 frames per second, and I want to override that drive mode and have it drop to single shooting with a slower shutter speed, and I can do that for times where my subject matter might come to a halt. So there is an example of my Recall Custom Hold 1 setting, which I've assigned to the focus hold on the lens, and most of the Sony lenses have that focus hold button which can be reassigned. And for Recall Custom Hold 2, which I have assigned to the AEL button, which is really easy to get to when you're shooting with your camera. And just press that button in and I can drop the shutter speed to 1/500th, which is more than enough when maybe using a 100-400 lens to shoot a sports person that has stopped moving rapidly and maybe is checking their time or has come to a halt at the end of the race. Of course, it's incredibly useful for birds. The bird is no longer in flight, it's suddenly perched. You don't want to shoot a bird perched on a branch at 20 frames per second. You just want to take one shot. And by dropping the shutter speed to 1/500th of a second instead of 1/2000th, the ISO is going to drop to a quarter of its initial setting. So instead of being 3200 ISO, it's going to be 800 ISO. So the quality of that still image of the bird sitting on the branch is going to be really spectacular. Let's move on to the subject of SteadyShot. Okay, so SteadyShot appears on all of those telephoto lenses that Sony make. And typically right out of the box, the mode on the lens is set to number 1. Now this is the correct setting if the camera and lens is very steady. The secret is in the name there. If the camera, you're trying to keep it very still and steady, 1 is a good setting. But of course what happens in sports action photography is we're not keeping the camera steady, we're moving to track that fast action. And 1 is no longer your friend. Basically you're going to be fighting with what the camera is trying to do, which is steady the frame because you're moving the camera. 1 can be incredibly useful if we're trying to shoot with long telephoto lens at quite slow shutter speeds. So for instance, just to show what I am capable of, I managed to capture this at 1/25th of a second at 400mm reach. Now you might need to take 3 or 4 shots, and if you've been drinking too much coffee, you may need to up that shutter speed somewhat because there will be a bit of vibration running through your hands. Okay, but as soon as the bird is flying left to right or right to left, we need to flick that steady mode to number 2. This basically disables the gyros that are keeping the horizontal movement, so we can move the camera left to right or right to left and not be fighting the stabilization of the lens and camera. So in those instances where it doesn't matter whether you're panning left or panning right, mode 2 is your friend. Now on the GM primes and on the 200-600 we don't have 2 steady shot modes, we have 3. 3 is typically when the movement is no longer just confined to horizontal. For instance, when big raptors are coming to perch, they typically dip and then raise as they're about to land on the branch. So the movement is predominantly vertical and no longer horizontal. If the camera is going to be panned vertically as well as horizontally, mode 3 becomes your friend. If you don't have a mode 3 or you don't have any steady shot modes on your lens, then you really just need to switch steady shot off. Now there might be a steady shot setting on the lens, you can switch it off there. If you have no steady shot settings on your lens, just go to the camera menu and switch steady shot off on the camera. Of course, that's a lot of settings to remember, and of course it's great that we can actually program most, if not all, of these settings to memories. So I've really carefully thought about what I've put in my function menus, what I've assigned my custom keys to. I've even put the seldom used menu settings in my menu, because for my workflows I never go into the main menu, so some people may struggle with the new menu layout, but once the camera is set up I don't actually visit those menus. Any menu items that I'm actually looking for will be in my menus, and I've carefully put those in 4 carefully considered pages. So, and I've also got those memories and recall custom hold settings. So it is of course possible to save all of those camera settings, so that if you ever had to initialize your camera because your camera went off for repairs, you could put all of those settings back on your camera with a single file that is stored on a memory card. So basically you just go to the setup menu, page 2, go to the save load settings and save those to a memory card, and then it's important to back those saved setting up onto a computer, because those settings are removed if you ever formatted that card. Now I have saved all of my settings, and I've actually made and share those settings with my premium patrons on patreon.com. And so if you could, for instance, download that file, put it on a memory card, put it in slot 1 on your camera, and basically completely configure your Alpha 1 so it's completely set up exactly the same as my Alpha 1. And I think my particular workflows ensure that I've always got a starting point, so I never miss a sequence of images that happen quite rapidly. Now, yes, I can override and fine-tune those settings, but I always have a start point which is reliable for capturing the decisive moment. And as I said, I do share those settings on my Patreon site. So if you do want to use those settings and you want to just sign up, you can just sign up for a single month, which costs just $10. There's no contracts or commitments. You can basically sign up and then unsign and get those settings just for $10. You can hang around, of course. You can, on the Patreon site, you can also download, the premium patrons can download a 500-page ebook which explains all of those workflows, only some of which I've been discussing in this video tutorial. So that concludes my overview of setting up all of my recommended settings for shooting action and birds in flight. I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Imaging Ambassador.